Dear friend, pull up a chair and settle in close. This is a story about a woman who arrived with nothing but 17 cents and a dream that had already died, about a blizzard that nearly took her life, but instead gave her one worth living, and about a man who thought his heart had turned to iron along with everything he touched. My grandfather used to say that the Lord works in mysterious ways, but I reckon he works in blizzards too, especially the kind that hit Wyoming in December of 1887. There's a particular kind of cold that doesn't just chill your bones but reaches down into your very soul and makes you wonder if you'll ever feel warmth again. Margaret Chen knew that cold. She'd known it in the empty boarding house room in Philadelphia after her mother drew her last rattling breath. She'd known it in the foreman's office at the textile mill when he told her the factory was closing and her services were no longer required. She'd known it when she counted out the last of her money, 17 cents, and a few copper pieces that wouldn't buy a decent meal, let alone passage back to a home that no longer existed. But standing on the running board of that mail coach 15 miles outside Iron Creek, Wyoming, with the wind screaming like all the devils of hell had been let loose and snow driving so thick she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face, Margaret discovered a new depth of cold altogether. This was the cold that killed. This was the cold that didn't give you time to regret your choices or make peace with your maker. This was the cold that took you quick and left your frozen body for the spring thaw to reveal. The driver, a weathered man named Hutchins, with tobacco-stained teeth and eyes as hard as the Wyoming winter, spat into the snow and shook his head. The coach had lost a wheel 2 miles back, snapped clean through on a frozen rut hidden beneath fresh powder. They'd limped this far, the 3 passengers and Hutchins, taking turns walking to spare the horses, but now the light was fading and the storm was building to something biblical. I got my own skin to think about, miss. Hutchins pulled his scarf tighter across his face, his words muffled but clear enough. Horse can carry 1, maybe 2 if they're small. You and the Reverend there, you're on your own. Town's that way, 15 miles straight west. You got maybe 2 hours of light left, if you can call this light. Margaret looked at the other passengers. Reverend Morrison, 70, if he was a day already blue around the lips from the cold. The widow Perkins, clutching her carpet bag, and 3 small children, the youngest, not more than 4 years old. And herself, 28 years old, alone in the world, with 17 cents to her name, and a letter in her pocket addressed to a man she'd never met at a ranch she'd never seen. The mathematics of it were brutal and simple. Hutchins could take the Reverend on his horse. The widow and her children could crowd into the covered freight wagon that had been following them, assuming it made it through. That left Margaret. You can't just leave her here. The widow's voice was sharp with horror. She'll freeze to death before she walks a mile. Hutchins shrugged a gesture that held no malice, but no mercy either. Then she should have stayed in Philadelphia. This is Wyoming, ma'am. The land don't care about fair. Margaret's fingers had already lost most of their feeling. She'd wrapped her hands in her spare petticoat, but it was thin cotton, meant for summer in the East, useless against this killing cold. Her feet in their button-up boots were blocks of ice. The wind cut through her wool traveling coat like it was tissue paper. She thought about the letter in her pocket, the one she'd written in response to an advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Widower rancher seeking companionship must be of good character and sound mind experience with accounts preferred. D. Blackwood Star, Forge Ranch, Iron Creek, Wyoming Territory. She'd written 3 drafts before sending the final version, each word chosen carefully, honestly. She'd told him about her mother's death, about the factory closing, about her 6 years keeping books for Miller and Sons Textile. She'd told him she wasn't looking for romance or rescue, just a chance at a new start and honest work for honest pay. His reply had been brief. Arrival expected December 15th. Prepare for winter. Bring warm clothes and good sense. The letter had included $20 for train fare, more money than she'd held in her hands in months. Now December 15th was tomorrow, and she was 15 miles from Iron Creek with a blizzard trying to kill her and a coach driver who'd already written her off as dead. I'll walk. Margaret's voice came out steady, surprising her. She'd expected it to shake, expected the fear that was climbing her spine to color every word, but something in her, some unyielding Pennsylvania Quaker stock that her mother had always said would either save her or damn her, kept her chin up and her tone level. 15 miles west, you said. Hutchins stared at her like she'd sprouted a second head. Miss, you won't make 3 miles. Look at you, you're city soft. That wind will strip the flesh right off your bones, then I'll make 3 miles before it does. Margaret picked up her valise, the leather handle, already stiff with frost. Inside were 2 dresses, a change of underclothes, her mother's Bible with the family tree written in the front cover, going back 6 generations, and a small leather journal filled with her mother's recipes and household accounts. Everything she owned in the world that mattered, that couldn't be measured in the 17 cents, jingling in her reticule. The Reverend reached out a trembling hand. Child, this is madness. Reverend, with respect, staying here is madness. Margaret looked at the coach, half buried in a drift, already, the windows frosted over the whole thing, listing to one side like a ship going down. That coach won't shelter anything come nightfall. The wind will tear right through it. At least if I'm moving, I'm making heat. Hutchins shook his head, but there was something like respect in his eyes, now grudging and small, but there nonetheless. Straight west. Don't deviate. If you see light, head for it. If you see nothing, keep the wind at your back and pray. Margaret nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak anymore. The fear was there, cold and sharp in her chest, but she pushed it down. She'd been afraid before. Afraid when her mother gasped her last breath. Afraid when the foreman handed her the final pay envelope. Afraid when she stepped onto the train heading west, with everything she owned and nothing guaranteed. Fear hadn't killed her yet. She started walking. The first mile was the hardest because she could still think. Her mind raced through all the ways this could end, all the mistakes she'd made to bring her to this point. She should have stayed in Philadelphia. She should have found work as a scullery maid or a washerwoman. She should have swallowed her pride and begged Aunt Margaret in Boston for help, even though the woman had made it clear that Margaret's mother had married beneath her station and the family wanted nothing to do with the consequences. Should have, could have, would have. The words became a rhythm in her head, matching her footsteps. Left foot should have, right foot could have, left foot would have, right foot too late now. The second mile was harder because she couldn't think anymore. The cold had seeped past her skin and into her blood and bones. Her teeth chattered so hard she bit her tongue and tasted copper. The valise grew heavier with each step until it felt like she was dragging an anvil. Twice she thought about dropping it, leaving it in the snow, but something fierce in her refused. That valise held her mother's memory. It held proof she'd existed, that her family had existed. She wouldn't leave it for the snow to bury. The third mile was when she started to die. She didn't realize it at first. The shivering stopped, which seemed like a blessing, until she remembered the widow Perkins back in Philadelphia, the one who'd frozen to death in her sleep during the cold snap of '83. They'd found her looking peaceful, they said, like she'd just drifted off. The doctor had explained it to the tenement women gathered around the body. First, you shiver. Then you stop shivering. Then you stop altogether. Margaret's feet no longer hurt. That was bad. She knew that was bad. Pain meant life. Numbness meant death creeping in. But it was hard to care when each step felt like wading through molasses, when her eyelids kept wanting to close, when the snow looked soft as a feather bed and twice as inviting. Just for a minute. She could lie down just for a minute, rest her eyes, gather her strength. Just 1 minute. Her knees buckled. The valise fell from her hand. The snow rushed up to meet her face, soft and cold and almost welcoming. This is how it ends, she thought with strange clarity. 28 years old, and I die in the snow like a lost calf. Mother would be so disappointed. That thought, more than the cold or the fear or the exhaustion, made her angry. Her mother hadn't raised her to give up. Her mother had scrubbed floors until her hands bled to keep them fed. Her mother had sat up nights, sewing piecework by candlelight until her eyes watered and her fingers cramped. Her mother had fought consumption for 8 months, fought it with every breath even when each one sounded like broken glass in her lungs, and she'd only let go when Margaret promised to keep fighting too. I promised. Margaret's lips barely moved. The words came out as frost on the air. I promised I'd keep fighting. She pushed herself up on hands that had no feeling left. The wind hit her like a fist trying to knock her back down. She grabbed the valise, held it against her chest like a shield, and took one step forward. Then another. Then another. She didn't see the light at first. Her eyes were frozen half shut, crusted with ice from her own tears. But she felt something, some change in the air, some break in the endless howling wind. She lifted her head, squinting against the driving snow. There. A flicker of orange, warm and impossible, cutting through the white fury of the storm. A window. A building. Life. Margaret stumbled toward it. She had no dignity left, no pride, no thought beyond reaching that light. Her feet tangled in her skirts. She fell, got up, fell again. The valise dragged behind her, the handle frozen to her hand. She couldn't let go even if she'd wanted to. Her fingers had locked around it like rigor mortis. The light grew closer. She could make out the shape of a building, now low and solid, built from stone and timber. Smoke rose from a chimney torn apart by the wind almost as soon as it cleared the roof. Next to the building stood what looked like a forge. The door opened just a crack, showing the red glow of banked coals inside. She was 10 feet from the door when her legs finally gave out completely. She pitched forward into a snowdrift face first and couldn't get up. Her body had nothing left. The cold had won. I tried, Mother. The thought came dreamy and distant. I tried so hard. Then a voice cut through the storm, deep and rough as gravel, close enough that she felt the vibration of it in her bones. Don't you dare die on my doorstep, woman. I've got enough ghosts without adding another. Hands gripped her shoulders, strong hands lifting her like she weighed nothing at all. Margaret tried to open her eyes, but her lashes were frozen shut. She felt herself being carried, felt the sudden blessed warmth of indoors, felt her body being lowered onto something soft. The hands worked efficiently, no wasted movement. They pulled off her frozen boots, her ice-stiffened coat, her snow-caked bonnet. They wrapped her in something wool and heavy, a blanket or a coat. They pressed a cup to her lips and tipped liquid fire down her throat. Whiskey her mind supplied distantly. Good whiskey, the kind that cost money. Drink. The voice again, commanding, not unkind but brooking no argument. Drink it all. She drank. The whiskey burned all the way down, but it was a good burn, a living burn. It spread through her chest like sunrise chasing back the deadly cold. Slowly, painfully, her eyes unstuck. She blinked up at the face hovering above her, backlit by firelight. He was tall, that was her first clear thought. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same Wyoming granite as his house. His eyes were gray, the color of smoke or storm clouds, and they studied her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. There was concern there, and calculation, and something else she couldn't quite name. He looked to be in his early 40s, maybe 42 or 43, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of hard work under an unforgiving sun. His hands bore the scars of his trade burn marks and old cuts mapping years at the forge. A blacksmith's hands? You're lucky. His voice matched his appearance, rough and low. Another hour out there and you'd be dead. As it is, you might still lose some toes. Can you feel your feet? Margaret tried to wiggle her toes. The attempt sent shooting pains up her legs that made her gasp. The man nodded, satisfied. Good. Pain means they're coming back. You'll hurt like hell for a while, but you'll keep them. He stood, moving to a small iron stove in the corner where a kettle steamed. The room was sparse, but well kept. A narrow bed against one wall, currently occupied by Margaret. A work table covered in papers and what looked like account books. A few shelves holding canned goods and basic supplies. In the corner near the stove, an anvil and a rack of tools, incongruous inside a living space, but somehow fitting. He poured hot water into a basin, brought it back, and began washing her hands and feet with a cloth. His touch was gentle, despite the size of his hands, methodical and careful. This was a man who knew how to handle delicate things, who understood that strength needed to be tempered with control. What's your name? He didn't look up from his work. Margaret. Her voice came out as a croak. Margaret Chen. His hand stilled for just a moment, then he resumed washing, working the blood back into her fingers. Chinese? My grandfather. 4th-generation American, same as my mother's family. Margaret watched his face for signs of the disgust or dismissal she'd encountered before. In Philadelphia, being a quarter Chinese hadn't mattered much in the textile district where half the workers were foreign-born. But she'd heard stories about the West, about the railroad camps, and the laws against Chinese workers. The man just nodded. Your grandfather have a trade accountant, kept books for a shipping company in San Francisco before moving east. Smart man. Numbers are harder than iron in their way. Iron you can see and touch. Numbers live in your head. He finished with her feet tucked them back under the blanket. You'll do. Margaret looked around the small room, finally registering details through the fog of exhaustion and residual cold. The account books on the table were a mess, papers scattered without order, ledgers lying open to pages covered in crossed-out figures and frustrated scrawls. A tray of ink-stained pens sat next to them, and several crumpled papers had missed the trash basket and lay on the floor instead. Where am I? Starforge Ranch. The man stood, moved back to the stove, began ladling what smelled like stew into a bowl. 15 miles west of where the coach broke down, I'd wager. You walked the whole way. I didn't have much choice. Margaret struggled to sit up. The room spun for a moment before settling. How did you know about the coach? I didn't. But I heard the storm coming 3 days ago, saw the clouds building. When you're expecting someone and the weather turns, you start watching the road. He brought her the bowl of stew, a spoon already in it. Eat slowly. Your stomach's too cold for anything sudden. The stew was simple, just beef and potatoes and carrots, but it was the best thing Margaret had ever tasted. She forced herself to eat slowly, even though every instinct screamed to shovel it down. You said you were expecting someone. She looked up at him over the rim of the bowl. Who? He pulled out a chair from the work table, turned it around, and sat with his arms resting on the back. From his pocket he drew a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases, like it had been read many times. He handed it to her without a word. Margaret's hands shook as she unfolded it. Her own handwriting stared back at her, the careful copperplate script her mother had taught her, every letter formed with precision. Dear Mr. Blackwood, I am writing in response to your advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer. I am 28 years old, of sound mind and good character, recently bereaved of my mother and seeking honest employment in a new place. I have 6 years' experience keeping accounts for Miller & Sons Textile, and I am proficient in double entry, bookkeeping, payroll management, and inventory control. I am not seeking charity or romance, but rather an opportunity to apply my skills in exchange for fair wages and a fresh start. I understand Wyoming is hard country, but I am not afraid of hard work or harsh conditions. If you are willing to give me a chance, I will prove myself worthy of it. Respectfully, Margaret Chen. She looked up at him, her heart suddenly pounding. You're D. Blackwood Duncan Blackwood. He watched her steadily. And you're the woman who wrote me 3 letters before sending that one. I could tell from the paper. Same stock, different ink densities. You wrote drafts. Margaret felt heat rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the whiskey or the fire. You could tell that I work iron, Miss Chen. I know what it looks like when someone tries something multiple times before getting it right. The folds in the paper told me the rest. First letter, creases all wrong, like you folded it in a hurry. Second letter, creases better, but ink smeared in one corner. Third letter, perfect, folds no smears. That's the one you sent. He tapped the letter in her hands. A woman who takes that much care with words is either very desperate or very honest. I was hoping for honest. Margaret's mind reeled. She'd come to Wyoming expecting to meet a rancher at the town of Iron Creek. She'd planned to present herself at the address on the letter to make a good impression, to prove her worth, before discussing terms of employment. Instead, she'd nearly died in a blizzard and been rescued by the very man she'd come to meet, who'd seen her at her absolute worst, half-frozen and helpless. I'm sorry. The words came out small. This isn't how I wanted to arrive. I wanted to be presentable, professional. I wanted to show you I could be useful. Duncan leaned back in his chair. You walked 15 miles in a killing blizzard rather than wait for rescue that might not come. That's more useful than showing up pressed and pretty. His eyes moved to her valise, still sitting by the door, crusted with ice. What's in there that was worth dragging through the snow? My mother's Bible, her recipe book, A change of clothes. Margaret met his gaze. Everything that proves I existed before today. Something shifted in Duncan's expression, a crack in that granite facade. Proof of existence. He stood, abruptly, moved to the window, looked out at the storm still raging. I know something about needing proof. I've got a trunk upstairs full of things that prove Anna existed. My wife. She died 4 years ago. Her and the baby both. Sometimes I take things out and hold them just to remember it was real, that I didn't imagine loving someone once. The raw honesty of it struck Margaret like a physical blow. In Philadelphia, people hid their grief behind proper mourning customs and social niceties. This man simply stated his loss like a fact, like the weather or the price of grain. I'm sorry for your loss. She meant it. The words weren't empty convention, but true sympathy, one bereaved person to another. Duncan turned back to her. His eyes were dry but haunted. After Anna died, I stopped living, just kept working. Forged a field to bed, same thing every day. Stopped talking to people unless I had to. Stopped going to town except for supplies. Built this room onto the forge because the house was too empty, too full of ghosts. I thought I was fine with it, thought I'd just work until I was too old to lift a hammer, then die and be done. He gestured at the account books on the table, but the work kept growing, and I kept forgetting things, debts people owed me, supplies I needed. I'd make something beautiful, a perfect piece, then forget to charge enough to cover materials. I was going under and didn't care enough to stop it. Margaret looked at the scattered papers with new understanding. This wasn't disorganization born of laziness, but of grief, of a man who'd stopped seeing the point of keeping track because he'd stopped seeing the point of anything. Then 3 months ago, Father O'Brien, he's the priest in town, he stopped by with some widows from the church. They were fussing about how I needed to eat better, needed to come to services, needed to remember I was still alive. One of them, Mrs. Patterson, she picked up my account book and just about had apoplexy. She said if I didn't get my affairs in order, I'd lose everything, and wouldn't that be a waste of what Anna had wanted for me? Duncan's jaw tightened. She was right. Anna would have been furious to see me let it all fall apart. So I thought about hiring a bookkeeper, but Iron Creek's too small to have one. Then I remembered Anna used to say that if you want something done right, you sometimes have to send away for it. Like she sent away for that piano from Chicago. Took 8 months to arrive, but it was exactly what she wanted. So I figured maybe I'd send away for a bookkeeper the same way. Put an ad in a few Eastern papers. Figured I'd get fortune hunters or women looking for a meal ticket. He pulled out another letter from his pocket, this one in his own hand, bold, angular script. I wrote replies to 14 women. Most of them couldn't spell, couldn't add, wrote about how they wanted a rich husband and a fine house. 2 of them were tolerable, but wanted me to send money up front for traveling clothes and such. I threw all those letters in the fire. He smoothed out Margaret's letter on the table. Then yours came. No flattery, no begging, just facts. Your qualifications, your situation, your terms. You didn't even ask what I'd pay you, just said, fair wages. A woman who doesn't lead with money isn't after money. A woman who admits she's bereaved and scared isn't trying to fool anyone. So I sent you the train fare and told myself I'd give you a chance, see if you were as honest in person as you were on paper. And now, Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. Now that you've met me, Duncan looked at her for a long moment. The firelight played across his face, softening the harsh lines, making him look younger, more uncertain. Now I think you're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish. Maybe both. You walked 15 miles in a blizzard. You held on to that valise like it was gold. You're sitting there half frozen, probably still can't feel your toes, and you're asking me about employment terms instead of begging to be sent back east. He shook his head slowly. I sent for a bookkeeper, Miss Chen. I think I got something rarer. I got someone who doesn't quit. The words settled over Margaret like a warm blanket. She'd spent the last 8 months feeling like a failure, like she'd let her mother down by losing the job at the mill, by not being able to afford the doctor's bills, by ending up with 17 cents and a one-way ticket to nowhere. But this man, this stranger who'd pulled her from the snow, he looked at her and saw strength. The account books. She nodded toward the cluttered table. May I see them? Duncan raised an eyebrow. You nearly died an hour ago, and I'll rest better knowing what I'm dealing with." Margaret pushed herself upright, blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. "My mother used to say idle hands invite idle thoughts. I'd rather work than worry." He studied her for another moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but you're staying in that chair and keeping that blanket on. First sign of shivering, you're back in bed." He brought the ledgers to her, 3 of them leather-bound and ink-stained. Margaret opened the first one and immediately winced. The entries were sporadic, some dated, some not. Dollar amounts appeared without explanation. Names were listed without transactions. Whole pages had been crossed out and rewritten. It was a nightmare of incomplete information and abandoned efforts. "When did you last balance these?" She flipped through pages, trying to find any kind of systematic record. "Balance." Duncan looked genuinely confused. "You mean add them up?" "I mean reconcile income against expenses, track accounts, receivable versus accounts payable, verify that your records match your actual financial position." Margaret's professional training was warring with her horror at the state of the books. "This isn't a ledger, Mr. Blackwood. This is a collection of random notes." For the first time, she saw something like embarrassment cross his face. "I know. Numbers and me, we don't get along. I can measure for metalwork down to a 1/16 of an inch, can calculate the temperature of iron by color alone, but put figures in a book and my mind just slips right off them like ice." Margaret pulled the blanket tighter and leaned over the ledger, her mind already working through the problem. "All right, first things first. Do you know how much money people owe you?" Duncan shrugged. "Some. Harris the carpenter owes me for new tools. Miller's family for a wagon repair. Thompson for horseshoes. But amounts? No idea. And how much do you owe the bank?" His face darkened. $2,400. Due December 31st, 2 weeks from now. Margaret's stomach dropped. "That's a significant sum. What's the interest rate? 8% when I signed." "But, Marlowe, he's the bank president. He keeps saying it's 15. Got into an argument about it last month, but I can't find my copy of the contract." "Do you remember the actual terms?" "I remember Anna signing as witness. I remember Marlowe's assistant young fellow named Hendricks writing it all out. I remember thinking 8% was steep but manageable." Duncan's hands clenched into fists. "But I can't prove any of it without the contract." Margaret's mind was racing now, the cold and exhaustion forgotten in the face of a concrete problem to solve. This was what she was good at, what she'd trained for. Numbers didn't lie, and they didn't die, and they could be wrangled into order if you knew how. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to be completely honest with me. How bad is it? Do you have the money to pay the bank?" "Not even close. I've got maybe $800 in cash and livestock. The land and forge would cover the rest, but if the bank calls the loan, I lose everything." He met her eyes, and she saw in them the same desperate determination she felt every time she looked in a mirror. "That's why I need a bookkeeper. I need to know exactly where I stand, what I'm owed, what I owe. I need someone to tell me if I'm fighting a battle I can actually win, or if I should just walk away now." Margaret looked down at the chaos of papers and ledgers. Somewhere in this mess was the information they needed. Numbers didn't disappear, they just got lost. And finding lost things, putting them back in order, that was something she could do. She pulled the nearest ledger closer, found a blank page, and picked up a pen. The familiar weight of it in her hand was steadying, grounding. This she understood. This she could control. "All right, Mr. Blackwood, we have 2 weeks. That's 14 days to find every penny you're owed, every contract you've signed, every receipt you've saved. It's not a lot of time, but it might be enough." She looked up at him, saw the hope starting to kindle in those gray eyes. "I can't promise I'll save your ranch, but I can promise I'll give you an honest accounting of where you stand. The truth, even if it's ugly. Is that acceptable?" Duncan Blackwood, Wyoming blacksmith widower man who'd given up on living 4 years ago, looked at Margaret Chen. Philadelphia bookkeeper orphan woman who'd walked 15 miles through a blizzard rather than give up. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a slight upward curve of his mouth, but it transformed his face. "Miss Chen," he said, his rough voice somehow gentler, "I think that's more than acceptable. I think that might be exactly what I sent for, even if I didn't know it at the time." Outside, the blizzard howled in rage, trying to tear the world apart. Inside, by the light of a forge fire and the heat of an iron stove, two people who'd been lost in their own kinds of cold began the slow, careful work of finding their way back to warmth. Margaret didn't know it yet, but she'd just found something worth more than all the train fare and promises in the world. She'd found a purpose. And Duncan, watching her bent over his hopeless ledgers with fierce concentration, didn't know it yet either. But he'd just found something he thought he'd lost forever when they buried Anna in the frozen ground. He'd found a reason to hope. The blizzard lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that sounded like the world-ending snow that piled against the windows in drifts taller than a man, cold so intense that ice formed on the inside of the glass despite the fire burning constant in the stove. 3 days trapped in a single room with a stranger who was somehow not a stranger at all. Margaret woke on the second morning to find Duncan already at the forge, the rhythmic ring of hammer on metal a counterpoint to the howling wind. She'd slept in his bed, he on a bedroll near the stove, and she'd argued about the arrangement until he'd simply stated that a man who let a woman sleep on the floor while he took the bed wasn't much of a man at all, and the conversation was over. Her feet still ached, a deep, burning sensation that the whiskey and warm water had only partially relieved, but she could wiggle her toes without wanting to scream. Progress. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and moved to the work table where she'd left the ledgers the night before. In the firelight, she'd made a preliminary assessment. 14 customers owed Duncan money for work completed. The amounts ranged from $12 for simple repairs to $240 for a custom-built gate and fence system. Total $870, maybe, if everyone paid. If she could verify the work had actually been completed and the bills delivered. Against that, Duncan owed the bank $2,400 due in 12 days now. He'd paid the interest faithfully for 3 years, but the principal sat untouched, a mountain of debt that grew more insurmountable with every passing month at 15% interest. Except he'd said 8%, and Vincent Marlowe, the bank president, said 15. Someone was lying, and Margaret would bet her last 17 cents it wasn't Duncan Blackwood. A man who couldn't keep a ledger straight didn't have the guile to lie about interest rates, but a banker who preyed on a grieving widower that she could believe. "You're up early." Duncan's voice made her jump. He stood in the doorway, connecting the living space to the forge proper. His face smudged with soot, his shirt sleeves rolled to reveal forearms corded with muscle and crisscrossed with old burn scars. "The work keeps me warm. You should rest more. I've rested enough." Margaret pulled out a chair, wincing as her feet protested the movement. "Tell me about these customers, starting with the largest debt." "Who's Thompson?" Duncan moved to the stove, poured coffee from a battered pot into 2 tin cups. "Rancher. Big spread, 20 miles north. I made him custom shoes for his breeding stock, special design, to prevent cracking in frozen ground. Finished the order in August, $240. Did you send him a bill?" "Told him when I delivered them. He said he'd settle up at year-end." "Nothing in writing." Duncan handed her a cup, his fingers brushing hers, briefly warm, despite the cold for just a moment. "Never thought I needed it. Known Thompson 15 years. He's good for it." Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup, breathed in the bitter steam. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't doubt Mr. Thompson's character, but without a written invoice, without his signature, acknowledging the debt, we have no legal recourse if he decides his memory differs from yours." Duncan's jaw tightened. "You think he'd cheat me? I think people forget what's convenient to forget. I think a verbal promise in August feels different in December when money's tight and winter's hard." Margaret met his eyes steadily. "We need documentation for every single customer, invoices, receipts, something they signed or can't dispute. And if there's nothing, then we create it now. We write out to each customer, we verify the work, we get signatures. We turn these vague debts into hard numbers that can't be argued away." She tapped the ledger. "This isn't about trust, Mr. Blackwood. This is about making sure that when we add up your assets, we're counting real money, not wishful thinking." Duncan was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. Finally he nodded. "All right. When the storm breaks, we'll start making rounds. But Miss Chen, I have to warn you. Some of these folks, they won't take kindly to a woman demanding payment. Then it's fortunate I'm not demanding. I'm requesting documentation. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. I've dealt with textile merchants who'd steal the buttons off a dead man's coat. Wyoming ranchers can't be worse than that. The third day, the storm finally exhausted itself. The wind died to nothing, the snow stopped falling, and an eerie quiet settled over the world. Duncan dug out the door, shoveling through drifts that came up to his chest while Margaret inventoried the supplies. They had enough food for perhaps 2 weeks if they were careful. Beans, salt pork, canned vegetables, flour, coffee, and a small precious store of sugar. Duncan hunted, he told her, and had venison hanging in the cold shed, frozen solid and safe from predators. They wouldn't starve, but they couldn't stay holed up forever either. The road to town will be impassable for days. Duncan stomped snow from his boots, his breath visible in the cold air that rushed in before he shut the door. But we can ride overland if we stick to high ground. Horse can manage what a wagon can't. Margaret looked up from the list she was making. We need to visit Thompson first, the largest debt. If we can secure that payment, it takes us from 800 to over 1,000 in verified assets. It's a hard ride in good weather. In this, Duncan shook his head. 20 miles through snow, that'll be hip-deep in places. We'd have to leave at first light, might not make it back before dark. Then we bring bedrolls and plan to shelter at his ranch. Margaret's tone was practical, brooking no argument. We have 12 days, Mr. Blackwood. We can't afford to waste them waiting for perfect conditions. Something flickered in Duncan's eyes, respect mixed with concern. You're not worried about propriety, riding out alone with a man you've known 3 days, possibly spending the night under his roof. Mr. Blackwood, I walked 15 miles through a blizzard to get here. I nearly froze to death on your doorstep. We've been sharing this room for 3 days with nothing but common sense and good manners between us. Margaret held his gaze. I think propriety took a back seat to survival somewhere around mile 12. Duncan's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. You're not like any bookkeeper I imagined. What did you imagine? An old man in spectacles, probably. Bent over ledgers, complaining about my penmanship. He moved to the forge, began banking the coals for travel. Instead, I got a woman who argues like a lawyer and doesn't know when to quit. I know exactly when to quit, Mr. Blackwood. Margaret returned to her lists. It's when the numbers balance and not a moment before. They left at dawn the next morning, the sky pale and clear, the sun glinting off snow so white it hurt to look at. Duncan rode a big bay gelding named Samson Patient and sure-footed. Margaret rode behind him, her arms around his waist, her face pressed against his back to shield from the wind that still bit despite the clear weather. She'd never been this close to a man who wasn't family. In Philadelphia, such contact would have been scandalous, unthinkable. But here, with miles of empty country around them and survival depending on shared warmth, it felt necessary, natural. She could feel the steady rhythm of Duncan's breathing, the solid strength of his frame. He smelled of smoke and leather and something else, something clean like snow and iron. You all right back there? His voice rumbled through his chest. Fine. Her lips were numb from cold despite the scarf wrapped around her face. How much further? Another hour, maybe more. The snow's deeper than I thought. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Rolling hills buried under white, stark black trees clawing at the sky, the distant mountains sharp as broken teeth against the horizon. No houses, no roads, no signs of human habitation, just endless winter stretching in every direction. This is what lonely looks like, Margaret thought. Not the boarding house room after her mother died, not the empty textile mill. This vast, indifferent emptiness that didn't care if you lived or died, that would cover your bones with snow and forget you ever existed. But Duncan knew the way. He navigated by landmarks, invisible to Margaret, a lightning-struck tree here, an oddly shaped rock formation there. He'd lived in this country for 20 years, he told her. Came west after the war too young to have fought, but old enough to want distance from the memories. Found work as an apprentice blacksmith, married the smith's daughter, inherited the forge when the old man's heart gave out. Anna was the one who wanted the ranch. Duncan's voice was barely audible over the crunch of hooves in snow. She said a forge was fine, but land was future, something to pass down, So we saved and bought 40 acres, built the house ourselves. Took 3 years. He paused. She died 6 months after we moved in. Margaret tightened her arms around him slightly, a gesture of comfort she wouldn't have dared 3 days ago. I'm sorry, she would have liked you. Abrupt, as if the words surprised him. She had a head for numbers, too. Used to keep the forge accounts before we married. After she tried to teach me, but I was hopeless. She'd laugh about it, say I could shape iron into anything, but couldn't shape numbers into cents. What happened to the accounts after she passed Duncan's shoulders tensed. I couldn't look at them, couldn't sit at the desk where she used to sit, couldn't open the ledgers she'd touched. So I stopped. Just started keeping track in my head, or trying to. He laughed a sound without humor. You saw how well that worked. Grief doesn't follow logic, Mr. Blackwood. If it did, we'd all manage it better. The Thompson Ranch appeared like a mirage, buildings materializing out of the white landscape. It was larger than Margaret expected, a proper ranch house, with a barn bunkhouse and several outbuildings. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, cattle huddled in a windbreak, dark shapes against the snow. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, tall and weathered, somewhere in his 50s. His eyes narrowed when he saw Duncan, then widened slightly when Margaret dismounted, stiff and cold, but determined to make a good impression. Blackwood. The man's voice was cautious. Didn't expect to see anyone out in this weather. Thompson. Duncan helped Margaret down, his hands steady on her waist. This is Miss Margaret Chen. She's helping me get my accounts in order. We've come about the horseshoes. Something shifted in Thompson's expression, a wariness that hadn't been there before. The shoes. Right. He glanced between them. Best come inside. No sense freezing while we talk business. The ranch house was warm, almost stifling after the cold outside. A woman Margaret assumed was Mrs. Thompson appeared with coffee, her eyes curious but kind. 3 children peeked around doorways, whispering to each other. Margaret pulled out a small notebook. She'd prepared her movements, professional and precise. Mr. Thompson, according to Mr. Blackwood's records, you commissioned custom horseshoes for your breeding stock in June. The work was completed and delivered in August. The agreed price was $240. Is that your recollection? Thompson shifted in his chair. Well, now I'm not sure the price was quite that high. Duncan started to speak, but Margaret silenced him with a look. She pulled out a second piece of paper, a sketch Duncan had made, showing the custom shoe design, with notes about materials and specifications. This is the design you approved. Hand-forged steel special toe clip, extra nail holes for stability in frozen ground. Material costs alone were $60. Labor at $3 per shoe, 80 shoes total, comes to $240, plus delivery. She looked up, her dark eyes calm but unyielding. Unless you'd like to contest the material costs or the labor rate, Thompson's wife cleared her throat. James, those shoes saved half our horses from going lame this winter. You said yourself it was the best money we'd spent. The rancher had the grace to look ashamed. You're right, Helen. You're both right. He stood, moved to a desk in the corner, pulled out a cash box. Problem is, I don't have $240 in cash right now. Had to buy feed after the early snow. I can give you $120. Now rest in 30 days. Margaret made a quick calculation. That's acceptable, provided we have it in writing. She produced a pre-written invoice filled in the amounts. You'll sign here acknowledging the debt, here agreeing to the payment terms, and here stating the balance due. Thompson signed without further argument. As Margaret blotted the ink, Duncan watched her with something like awe. She'd done in 10 minutes what would have taken him weeks of awkward conversation and probable failure. Thank you for your business, Mr. Thompson. Margaret folded the signed invoice carefully, tucked it into her notebook. We'll return in 30 days for the balance. Outside, Duncan boosted her back onto Sampson, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. That was remarkable. That was business, Mr. Blackwood. Margaret settled herself, her arms finding their place around his waist as naturally as breathing. 1 customer down, 13 to go. They visited 3 more debtors that day. Harris the carpenter, who owed $120 and paid in full with a combination of cash and lumber. The Miller family, who owed $45 for wagon repair and argued the price until Margaret produced Duncan's original estimate, signed by Mr. Miller himself. They'd forgotten signing it conveniently, but couldn't deny their own signature. They paid $30 and promised the rest within the week. By the time they turned toward home, dusk was falling, and Margaret's carefully documented collection totaled $370 in cash and commitments. Not enough, not nearly enough, but a start. The sunset painted the snow in shades of pink and gold, beautiful and cold. Duncan guided Samson along a ridge line, the horse's breath steaming in the frigid air. Margaret, exhausted and aching from hours in the saddle, rested her head against Duncan's back and let herself drift. She woke to stillness. They'd stopped. Duncan had dismounted and was standing beside the horse, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read in the gathering darkness. "We're not going to make it back tonight." His voice was matter-of-fact. Too dark, too cold, too risky. "There's a line shack about a mile from here. Shelter, firewood, basic supplies. We'll stay there." Margaret nodded, too tired to argue or worry about propriety. Duncan lifted her down, and she stumbled, her legs refusing to work after so long on horseback. He caught her, steadied her, and for a moment they stood there in the snow, his hands on her waist, her hands on his shoulders, both of them breathing clouds of frost in the air. "Can you walk? I'll manage." But her first step proved her a liar. Her legs buckled, and Duncan swept her up without hesitation, carrying her the way he'd carried her that first night. This time, though, she was conscious enough to notice the ease with which he held her, the steadiness of his gait through knee-deep snow, the way his heart beat slow and strong beneath her ear. The line shack was exactly what he'd promised. One room barely larger than his forge quarters with a stone fireplace, a rope bed with a straw tick mattress, and shelves holding canned goods and coffee. Duncan deposited Margaret on the bed, then set about building a fire with the efficiency of long practice. Soon, flames crackled, and heat began to fill the small space. Duncan produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, not much of a meal, but enough. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared exhaustion and shared purpose. $370. Duncan spoke finally, his voice rough from cold and disuse. "And that's more than I've collected in the last 6 months combined. It's a start." Margaret pulled her notebook from her coat pocket, studied the figures by firelight. "Tomorrow we tackle the smaller debts. 5 customers in town, amounts ranging from $12 to $60. If we're lucky, we can collect most of it in a single day. And if we're not lucky, then we document everything, establish legal claim, and move forward anyway." Margaret looked up at him. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to understand something. These collection efforts, they're important. They'll help. But even if we collect every penny you're owed, we'll have perhaps $1,500 against a debt of $2,400. We're still short. I know." He stared into the fire, the flames casting shadows across his face. "That's why we need to prove Marlowe's lying about the interest rate. If the contract says 8%, not 15%, the actual debt is maybe $2,000. Still high, but possible. Do you remember anything else about signing that contract? Any details at all?" Duncan closed his eyes, thinking. It was in his office. Marble-top desk, leather chairs. Hendricks, his assistant, did the writing. Young fellow, maybe 25, nervous hands. He kept adjusting his spectacles. Marlowe stood over him the whole time, telling him what to write. Anna sat next to me, read the whole thing through twice before letting me sign. She asked about the interest rate specifically. Marlowe said 8% was standard for agricultural loans, and the contract itself. What did it look like? Heavy paper blue ink, Marlowe's signature big and flourishing at the bottom. Hendricks signed as witness. Anna signed too. He opened his eyes, looked at Margaret. There were 2 copies. Marlowe kept one, gave me the other. I put mine in the house in Anna's desk. After she died, I couldn't bear to touch her things. The desk is still locked. I don't even know where the key is. Margaret's mind raced. We need that contract. Tomorrow, before we go into town, we find that key. We open that desk. If the contract's there, we have him. If it's not, we tear the house apart until we find it. And if it's truly lost, then we find Hendricks. Margaret's voice was firm. If he wrote the contract, he knows what it said. Young men with nervous hands don't usually have the stomach for fraud. He might talk. Marlowe will have gotten to him, perhaps, Or perhaps a young clerk's conscience is worth more than his job security. Margaret tucked the notebook away. We won't know until we try. The fire burned low. Duncan added more wood, then arranged their bedrolls, one on the bed, one on the floor. Margaret started to protest, but he cut her off with a look. Miss Chen, we've had this argument before. You're still recovering from near death by freezing. I'm a Wyoming blacksmith who slept in worse places than a line shack floor. There's no dishonor in basic human decency. Margaret smiled despite her exhaustion. You're a stubborn man, Mr. Blackwood, says the woman who walked 15 miles through a blizzard. She settled onto the bed, the straw tick rustling beneath her. The room was warm now, the fire radiating heat that soaked into her bones. Outside, wind whistled through the eaves, but it was distant, no longer threatening. Mr. Blackwood, yes, Miss Chen, thank you for all of this, for saving my life, for trusting me with your accounts, for not treating me like I'm fragile or foolish. Duncan was quiet for a long moment. Thank you for not giving up. On the walk, on the books, on any of it. Most people would have turned back or broken down. You just keep pushing forward. My mother used to say that forward is the only direction worth traveling. Backward is memory, standing still is death. Forward is hope. Your mother was a wise woman. She was a stubborn woman. Margaret's voice softened with affection and grief, which I suppose amounts to the same thing. Sleep came easily despite the hard bed and unfamiliar surroundings. Margaret's last conscious thought was of numbers columns adding up in her mind, debts and credits balancing toward an answer she couldn't quite see yet. In his bedroll on the floor, Duncan lay awake longer, staring at the ceiling, thinking about a woman who could walk through a blizzard and face down a rancher with equal determination, who could make him laugh and make him hope both things he'd thought he'd lost forever. The key was in the last place anyone would look. Inside Anna's sewing basket, tucked into a small pocket sewn into the lining, along with a folded note in Anna's handwriting. Duncan, if you're reading this, it means you finally opened my desk. I'm glad. Don't mourn me forever. Build the future we planned. The key is for locks, but also for moving forward. With love, always, Anna. Duncan's hands shook as he read it. Margaret, standing beside him in the empty house, her hand rested gently on his shoulder. She was a wise woman. Yes, his voice was thick. She was. The desk opened easily. Inside, organized with the precision Margaret recognized from her own work, were papers in neat folders, household accounts, forged receipts, and there in a leather portfolio, the bank contract. Margaret pulled it out with reverent care, unfolded it, read through, twice to be certain. Then she looked up at Duncan, triumph blazing in her dark eyes. 8%. It's right here, Mr. Blackwood. 8% per annum principal and interest due December 31st, 1890. She pointed to the signatures. Your signature, Anna's signature as witness, Hendricks as notary, and Marlowe's signature as bank president. Duncan leaned over her shoulder, reading the words himself as if he couldn't quite believe them. He lied. All this time he's been charging me 15%, and the contract says 8. Margaret's mind was already calculating. At 8% over 3 years with your payments on interest, only the total debt is $1,892. At 15%, it's $2,400. She looked up at him. Mr. Blackwood, Vincent Marlowe has been stealing approximately $600 from you. That's fraud. That's criminal. What do? We confront him. Tomorrow, we walk into that bank with this contract and we demand an accurate accounting. Margaret's voice was steel wrapped in silk. And if he refuses, we take this to the territorial court. We ruin him. He'll fight back. Let him. Margaret folded the contract carefully, tucked it into her notebook with the rest of their documentation. We have the truth, we have the law, and we have 11 days. That's more than enough to destroy a lying banker. The next morning they rode into Iron Creek. The town was small, maybe 200 souls built around a single main street lined with false-fronted buildings. The general store, the saloon, the hotel, the livery, and there at the end, larger than the rest, Iron Creek Bank and Trust. Margaret had dressed in her best surviving clothes, a dark blue wool dress that had survived the blizzard, relatively intact, her mother's cameo at her throat. Her hair was pinned up severe and professional. She carried her notebook like a weapon. Duncan walked beside her, tall and solid, in a clean shirt and vest. They made Margaret thought an interesting pair. The blacksmith and the bookkeeper about to go to war. Vincent Marlowe was a fat man, not heavy, but soft, with manicured hands and slicked back hair. His office was all dark wood and brass fixtures designed to intimidate. He looked up when they entered, his smile pleasant and utterly false. "Duncan, good to see you." His eyes flicked to Margaret, dismissive. "And who's this Margaret Chen?" "I'm Mr. Blackwood's accountant." Margaret didn't sit, though Marlowe gestured to chairs. "We're here about the loan." Marlowe's smile tightened. "The loan is quite straightforward, $2,400 due in 11 days. I trust you're here to discuss payment arrangements. We're here to discuss fraud." Margaret pulled out the contract, laid it on Marlowe's desk with precision. "This contract specifies 8% interest. You've been charging 15. That's 7% theft over 3 years, compounding annually. The mathematics are quite clear." Marlowe's face went red, then white. He picked up the contract, studied it, and Margaret saw his mind racing behind his eyes, looking for an angle, a loophole, a way out. "This contract is outdated." His voice was smooth, practiced. "We renegotiated terms after Mrs. Blackwood's death. Duncan agreed to higher interest in exchange for extended payment timelines. I agreed to nothing." Duncan's voice was quiet but deadly. "And there's no second contract because there was no renegotiation. You just started charging me more and hoped I wouldn't notice. That's a serious accusation." Marlowe stood trying to loom, but Margaret didn't flinch. "Do you have proof?" Margaret pulled out her notebook, opened to a page of calculations. "I have 3 years of payment receipts. I have the amounts you claimed were owed at each payment date. I have the mathematical impossibility of those amounts under 8% interest." She met his eyes with absolute conviction. "I have everything I need to prove you've been systematically defrauding Mr. Blackwood. The only question is whether you'd like to settle this privately or in territorial court." The silence stretched. Marlowe looked at the contract, at Margaret's calculations, at Duncan's stone face. His own face worked through several expressions before settling on something like defeat mixed with rage. "Even if what you say is true, even if there was an error in accounting, the bank is owed money." Marlowe's tone turned pleading. "Duncan agreed to pay. The debt exists at 8%. Margaret's voice was relentless, "which makes the actual debt, including all payments made, $1,892, not $2,400. She produced another paper. "I've prepared an amended payment schedule. Mr. Blackwood will pay the legitimate debt in full by the due date. But we expect written acknowledgement that the overpayment of $608 will be refunded or credited." "That's impossible." Marlowe sputtered. "The bank doesn't have liquid funds to just hand over that kind of money." "Then you have 11 days to find them. Because if Mr. Blackwood's full and legitimate debt isn't satisfied and the fraudulent charges aren't corrected, I will personally take this case to every newspaper and court between here and Cheyenne." Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to something cold and certain. "I'm very good at making numbers tell stories, Mr. Marlowe, and the story these numbers tell is that you're a thief who preys on grieving widowers. How do you think that story will play in this town? Vincent Marlowe was beaten, and he knew it." His shoulders sagged, the bluster draining out of him like air from a punctured bladder. "I'll need to verify the calculations, of course." Margaret handed him a copy of her work, every figure meticulously documented. "You have until tomorrow at noon. After that I file with the territorial court." They left him there, surrounded by papers, his empire of lies crumbling around his ears. Outside, the winter sun was shining the street, busy with people going about their business, unaware that justice had just been served in quiet accounting terms. Duncan stopped in the middle of the street, turned to Margaret, and for the first time since she'd met him, he laughed. Really laughed, deep and full and genuine. "That was beautiful. You destroyed him with arithmetic." "Mathematics don't lie, Mr. Blackwood." Margaret allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. "Unlike bankers." He looked at her, really looked at her, standing there in her borrowed coat and determined expression, this woman who'd walked out of a blizzard and into his life and turned everything upside down in the best possible way. "Miss Chen, I need to ask you something." "Yes, the job I offered it was for a bookkeeper, professional arrangement room and board plus wages. But I'm thinking now that maybe that's not what I want anymore." His voice was rough with emotion he wasn't practiced at expressing. "These past days working with you, watching you face down Thompson and Marlowe, eating jerky in a line shack and sleeping on a straw tick, I've felt more alive than I have in 4 years, and I'm wondering if maybe you might consider something more permanent than professional." Margaret's heart was pounding, but her voice stayed steady. "Mr. Blackwood, are you asking what I think you're asking? I don't know." "What do you think I'm asking?" "I think you're asking if I'd consider staying not just as your bookkeeper, but as something else. Something that involves legal commitments and long-term partnership." Duncan nodded slowly. "That's about the size of it, though I'm doing it badly. Anna would laugh at me. She was good with words, and I'm just good with iron. But what I'm trying to say is that I sent for a bookkeeper and got someone who made me remember what it feels like to look forward instead of back. Someone who makes me want to build that future Anna wrote about, and I'm asking badly if you might want to build it with me." Philadelphia felt like another lifetime. The empty room, the lost job, the 17 cents, all of it distant as a half-remembered dream. She thought about her mother's voice saying forward is the only direction worth traveling. She thought about ledgers balanced and contracts honored, and a man who carried her through blizzards, both literal and financial, without ever making her feel weak. "Mr. Blackwood, I came west looking for work. I found a purpose. I came looking for stability. I found a partner." She met his eyes, saw the hope and fear, and something deeper burning there. "So yes, the answer is yes. But we're going to do this properly. We finish saving your ranch first, then we talk about futures." Duncan's smile was sunrise breaking over mountains. "That's fair. That's more than fair." He offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked down the street toward the general store to continue their collections, two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and decided against all odds and logic and propriety that maybe the worst circumstances made the best beginnings. They had 11 days to save a ranch. After that, they had the rest of their lives to build something neither of them had dared hope for. A home, a partnership, a future hammered out of iron and numbers and stubborn refusal to quit. In his office, Vincent Marlowe stared at the contract and the calculations and knew he was finished. In the general store, Duncan and Margaret collected $47 from a grateful shopkeeper who'd forgotten he owed for custom shelf brackets. In the livery, another 32. In the hotel, 25. The numbers added up, the future took shape. And forward, always forward, they went. The town hall in Iron Creek was built from the same stubborn Wyoming timber and stone as everything else in the territory, designed to withstand wind and weather, and the occasional hard truth. On the morning of December 30th, with 1 day remaining before Duncan Blackwood's debt came due, that hall filled with more people than it had seen since the territorial elections of '86. They came because word had spread, the way word always spread in small towns, carried on whispers and speculation and the kind of gossip that traveled faster than telegraph wires. They came because Vincent Marlowe had made enemies in his 5 years as bank president, foreclosing on the widow Henderson when her husband died of pneumonia, pressing the Miller family so hard on their store debt that they'd nearly lost everything, charging interest rates that somehow always seemed higher than anyone remembered agreeing to. They came because Duncan Blackwood was one of their own, a man who'd shod their horses and mended their plows and never once charged unfairly, and because the woman who'd appeared out of a blizzard to save him was the kind of story people wanted to believe in. Margaret stood at the front of the hall, her dark blue dress pressed, as well as circumstances allowed, her mother's cameo catching the winter light from the high windows. She'd spent the previous night preparing her case with the kind of meticulous attention her mother had taught her, every document organized, every figure verified 3 times, every argument anticipated and countered. The leather portfolio on the table before her held not just Duncan's salvation, but her own proof of worth, evidence that she was more than a desperate woman who'd answered a stranger's advertisement. Judge Warren sat behind a borrowed desk, a circuit judge who happened to be in Iron Creek for the quarterly sessions. He was 70 if he was a day, with white mutton chops and eyes that had seen every variety of human foolishness. Beside him sat Father O'Brien, acting as witness and community representative, his weathered hands folded on his Bible. Vincent Marlowe sat across the aisle with 2 lawyers he'd brought from Cheyenne, both in expensive suits that looked obscene in the simple hall. The lawyers had arrived on the morning train cold and irritable and full of technical language designed to intimidate. Marlowe himself wore confidence, like an ill-fitting coat, his face set in lines of righteous certainty that Margaret recognized from every man who'd ever underestimated her. Duncan sat in the front row, his Sunday best clean but worn, his hands clasped tight enough that his knuckles showed white. He'd wanted to stand beside Margaret to face this together, but she'd been firm. This was her arena, her battle, and he would trust her to fight it the way she'd trusted him to carry her through the blizzard. Judge Warren rapped his gavel, the sound sharp in the crowded room. This is an informal hearing to resolve a disputed debt between Iron Creek Bank and Trust and Mr. Duncan Blackwood. Miss Chen, as you've brought the complaint, you'll present first. Margaret stood, smoothed her skirt with hands that didn't shake despite the fear singing through her veins, and began. Your Honor, the facts of this case are straightforward. 3 years ago, Mr. Blackwood borrowed $2,000 from Iron Creek Bank to expand his ranch operations. The loan contract, which I have here, specifies 8% annual interest with the principal and interest due on December 31st of this year. She placed the contract on the judge's desk, the blue ink and formal signatures clear and indisputable. Mr. Blackwood has made regular interest payments according to the terms. However, Mr. Marlowe has claimed the debt is $2,400, citing an interest rate of 15%. This is fraudulent. One of Marlowe's lawyers stood, his voice oily with practiced disdain. Your Honor, Miss Chen is not a licensed attorney. Her standing to bring this complaint is questionable at best. Miss Chen is Mr. Blackwood's duly appointed accountant and business representative. Judge Warren's tone was dry. Unless you're suggesting that bookkeepers have no place in financial disputes, Counselor, I suggest you sit down and let her finish. The lawyer sat. Margaret allowed herself the tiniest smile before continuing. I have documented every payment Mr. Blackwood has made over 3 years. She produced a ledger, her handwriting precise in columns of dates and amounts. At 8% interest, these payments satisfy all accrued interest. The remaining principal is $2,000. However, Mr. Marlowe's accounting shows a balance of $2,400. She turned to face the banker directly. The difference is the $608 in fraudulent interest charges. That's a lie. Marlowe half rose from his seat, his face flushing. The contract was amended after Mrs. Blackwood's death. Duncan agreed to higher interest in exchange for extended payment terms. Where is this amended contract? Margaret's voice was sharp as a razor. Show it to the judge. It was verbal. Marlowe's lawyer stood again. A gentleman's agreement common in frontier banking. Your Honor, I have here the Territorial Banking Code. Margaret produced another document marked with ribbon bookmarks. Section 12, Paragraph 4. All modifications to existing loan contracts must be documented in writing and signed by both parties. Verbal modifications to interest rates are explicitly prohibited and legally void. She looked at Marlowe's lawyer. There is no such thing as a gentleman's agreement when it comes to charging interest. The law exists precisely to prevent this kind of fraud. Judge Warren studied the contract, then Margaret's ledger, then the banking code. His silence stretched until even the whispers in the crowd died away. Finally, he looked up. Mr. Marlowe, do you have documentation of this alleged verbal agreement? Any witnesses besides yourself? Duncan agreed to it. Marlowe's voice had lost its certainty. He knew the situation had changed, that he needed different terms. Mr. Blackwood, did you agree to modified interest rates? The judge's eyes moved to Duncan. No, Your Honor. Duncan's voice was steady, clear. I never agreed to pay more than 8%. I didn't even know Marlowe was charging 15 until Miss Chen showed me the numbers. The judge made a note, then looked back at Margaret. Continue, Miss Chen. This brought her to the dangerous part, the gambit she'd planned in the cold hours before dawn. Your Honor, I believe the fraud goes deeper than Mr. Blackwood's loan alone. I've reviewed public records at the county office with Father O'Brien's assistance. She nodded to the priest, who produced a stack of documents. In the past 5 years, Iron Creek Bank has foreclosed on 7 properties. In every case, the final debt claimed was significantly higher than the original loan amount. In every case, the property owner insisted they'd been charged unfair interest rates. And in every case, Mr. Marlowe claimed verbal modifications to the original contracts. Father O'Brien stood his voice, carrying the authority of decades serving the community. The Henderson foreclosure was particularly grievous. Martha Henderson's husband borrowed $1,500 at 9%. When he died 18 months later, Marlowe claimed the debt was $2,200. The widow lost her home and now lives in my church's charity house. A murmur ran through the crowd. Margaret saw recognition on faces, anger building. She pressed on. The Miller store. Original loan $800 at 7%. After 2 years, Marlowe claimed the debt was $1,300. Only community intervention prevented foreclosure. That's enough. Marlowe's lead lawyer was on his feet, his voice sharp with desperation. Your Honor, this hearing is about Mr. Blackwood's debt, not wild accusations about other loans. Judge Warren's expression had gone cold. Actually, Counselor, if Miss Chen is alleging a pattern of fraudulent banking practices, that's very much relevant to this case. It speaks to Mr. Marlowe's credibility. He leaned forward. Miss Chen, do you have evidence that these other loans were similarly misrepresented? Margaret had been waiting for this question. She pulled out a folder, placed it before the judge. I have the original loan contracts for 3 of the foreclosed properties. The families kept copies. In each case, the contract specifies a lower interest rate than Mr. Marlowe claimed at foreclosure. She paused, letting the weight of the documents speak. Your Honor, Vincent Marlowe has been systematically defrauding the citizens of Iron Creek. He targets vulnerable borrowers, people in grief or financial distress, people unlikely to challenge his accounting. He inflates interest rates verbally while the original contracts tell a different story. And when they can't pay the inflated debts, he forecloses and enriches himself with their property. The silence in the room was absolute. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the attention of every person present focused on this moment. She'd gambled everything on this accusation, had spent a week tracking down former borrowers, convincing them to share their documents, building a case that went far beyond Duncan's single loan. If she was wrong, if the judge dismissed her evidence as hearsay or irrelevant, Duncan would still owe money they didn't have, and Marlowe would destroy them both out of spite. But if she was right, if the pattern held and the judge saw what she saw, then they had a chance. Judge Warren examined the contracts in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up at Marlowe. Mr. Marlowe, these are serious allegations. What do you have to say? Vincent Marlowe had gone from red to white to a sickly gray. His lawyers whispered urgently to him, but he shook his head, seemed to deflate. When he spoke, his voice was small, defeated. Banking is a complex business. Interest calculations can be confusing. If there were errors in accounting, they were honest mistakes that always favored the bank. Margaret's voice was scalpel sharp. Honest mistakes that cost 7 families their homes. Honest mistakes that would have cost Mr. Blackwood his ranch if I hadn't caught them. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request a full audit of Iron Creek Bank's loan portfolio. I believe we'll find similar discrepancies across multiple accounts. This is outrageous. Marlowe's lawyer made one last attempt. You can't audit an entire bank based on one woman's accusations. I can if those accusations are supported by documented evidence of fraud. Judge Warren's voice was granite. And I will. He looked at Marlowe with undisguised disgust. Mr. Marlowe, I'm ordering an immediate freeze on all foreclosure proceedings pending investigation. Furthermore, I'm ruling in favor of Mr. Blackwood. The legitimate debt under the original contract terms is, he consulted Margaret's figures, $1,892, not $2,400. Mr. Blackwood has until tomorrow to satisfy that debt. If he does, the matter is closed. Relief flooded through Margaret so suddenly she had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. $1,892. They had it. Barely, but they had it. The collections over the past 10 days, the cash Duncan had saved, the payment from Thompson, it all added up to just over $1,900. But Judge Warren wasn't finished. As for the broader allegations, I'm appointing an independent auditor to review all of Iron Creek Bank's loans from the past 5 years. If the pattern Miss Chen describes is confirmed, Mr. Marlowe, you'll face criminal charges for fraud. He rapped the gavel. This hearing is adjourned. The room erupted. People surged forward, some to congratulate Duncan, others to glare at Marlowe, still others to talk to Margaret, to thank her, to tell their own stories of unfair treatment by the bank. Father O'Brien made his way through the crowd, his eyes bright with tears. "You've done a great thing today, Miss Chen, not just for Duncan but for all of us." He gripped her hand. "The Lord works through willing vessels, and today you were his instrument." Margaret, overwhelmed by the attention and the adrenaline crash, could only nod. She searched the crowd for Duncan, found him standing at the edge, watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Pride, yes, and relief, but something deeper too, something that looked like wonder. He made his way to her through the press of bodies, and when he reached her, he didn't speak. He simply took her hand, squeezed it once, and the warmth of that touch said everything words couldn't. Outside the hall, Vincent Marlowe climbed into his carriage, his lawyers beside him, and left Iron Creek without looking back. He would resign from the bank within the week, would leave Wyoming for California, would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder for the law he'd spent 5 years breaking. But in that moment, driving away through the December snow, he was just a small man whose small cruelties had finally caught up to him. The wedding took place on New Year's Eve in the small church at the edge of Iron Creek. Father O'Brien performed the ceremony with tears in his eyes, his voice shaking slightly when he pronounced them man and wife. The church was packed, every pew filled with townspeople who'd come to witness not just a marriage, but a new beginning. Margaret wore a dress borrowed from Mrs. Thompson, altered to fit by 3 church ladies who'd worked through the night. It was simple cream wool, nothing fancy, but it was clean and whole, and someone else's kindness made manifest in cloth. Her hair was pinned up with her mother's tortoiseshell combs, the only vanity she'd allowed herself. Duncan wore his Sunday suit freshly pressed, his hair trimmed, his face shaved clean. He looked younger, without the perpetual stubble, more like the man he'd been before grief had etched lines around his eyes. When Margaret walked down the aisle on Father O'Brien's arm, her mother's Bible in her hands, Duncan's face transformed with a smile that made her forget every hard mile, every cold night, every moment of fear and doubt. The vows were traditional, the words worn smooth by centuries of repetition, but no less powerful for their familiarity. To have and to hold, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, they meant something different here, Margaret thought. In a land where weather could kill you and banks could steal from you and a blizzard could deposit a stranger on your doorstep who'd save your life in more ways than one. When Father O'Brien said, "You may kiss the bride," Duncan cupped Margaret's face gently as if she were molten glass and kissed her with a gentleness that belied his strength, a kiss that tasted of promises and futures and hope finally allowed to bloom. The reception was held in the church hall, a potluck affair where everyone brought what they could. There wasn't much winter in Wyoming, never allowed for much, but there was venison stew and fresh bread and a cake Mrs. Patterson had made with her precious hoarded sugar. There was music, too, a fiddle and a harmonica playing old songs and dancing that went on until the lanterns burned low. Duncan danced with his bride, holding her close, moving with surprising grace for such a large man. "You saved me," he said into her hair. "Not just the ranch, me. You saved me first." Margaret leaned into his warmth, felt his heart beating steady and strong against her cheek. "In the blizzard, you could have left me there. Never." The word was absolute, brooking no argument. "From the moment I heard your voice in that storm, you were mine to protect. I just didn't know yet that you'd end up protecting me, too." They left the reception before midnight, walking hand in hand through snow that crunched beneath their feet under stars so bright and cold they looked like holes punched in the sky. The forge house glowed with firelight, warm and welcoming, no longer a refuge from grief, but a true home. Inside, Duncan had made changes in the week leading up to the wedding. He'd moved Anna's things with reverence and care, packing them in the trunk he'd mentioned, storing them in the attic of the main house, with a promise to share those memories someday, but not to live in them anymore. He'd cleaned and organized, had even attempted to tidy his papers before giving up and leaving that to Margaret's more capable hands. Now the space felt different. The bed had fresh linens, wedding gifts from the church ladies. Candles burned on the mantel, more luxury than practical need. A bottle of good whiskey sat on the table, 2 glasses beside it. Margaret poured them each a measure, handed one to Duncan. "To new beginnings," she said, "to stubborn women who don't know when to quit." Duncan touched his glass to hers. "May I never be smart enough to discourage you." They drank the whiskey burning warm, then Duncan set his glass aside and pulled something from his pocket. It was small, wrapped in cloth, clearly handmade. "I made you something." His voice was uncertain in a way it never was when discussing iron or horses or debt. "It's not much, nothing like you deserve, but it's what I know how to give." Margaret unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was a ring forged from iron and silver, the metals twisted together in an intricate pattern that caught the candlelight. The silver formed a delicate rose, every petal individually shaped, resting on a band of black iron. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that came from skill and patience and love made tangible. "Duncan, it's exquisite." She slipped it onto her finger beside the plain gold band Father O'Brien had blessed during the ceremony. "You made this. Started it the day after the hearing." He touched the ring gently, his rough fingers careful of the delicate metalwork. "Iron for strength, silver for beauty. Together they're stronger than either alone, like us." Margaret looked up at him, this man who could express in metal what he struggled to say in words. "I love you." The words came out simply, honestly, the way she'd been taught to keep accounts. No flourishes, no poetry, just truth. Duncan's eyes shone in the candlelight. "I love you too. Have since you sat at my table half frozen and started organizing my disaster of a life like it was the most natural thing in the world." Their second kiss was different from the first. In the church it had been for witnesses, for tradition, for making official what they both already knew. This kiss was private, unhurried, the beginning of a conversation they'd have, in touches and breath, and the language of two people learning each other in the quiet dark. The wedding night passed as such nights do, in tenderness and discovery, in laughter when awkwardness struck and comfort when uncertainty arose. They were neither of them young enough to expect perfection or old enough to have forgotten how to hope for it. What they had was real, and that was enough. Morning came cold and clear, the first day of 1888, the first day of the rest of their lives. Margaret woke to find Duncan already up stoking the fire, coffee brewing on the stove. He brought her a cup in bed, an intimacy that felt both foreign and exactly right. "Happy New Year, Mrs. Blackwood." He sat on the edge of the bed, his hand finding hers. "How does it feel to be a married woman? The same as it felt yesterday, mostly." Margaret sipped the coffee, strong and bitter and perfect. "Except now I have legal standing to manage your accounts without anyone questioning my authority." Duncan laughed, that deep, genuine sound she'd learned to love. Ever practical. What would you do without numbers to organize? Probably go mad. She set the coffee aside, grew serious. "Duncan, we need to talk about the future, the real future, not just today and tomorrow." "All right." He settled in to listen, his attention complete. "The ranch is secure now, the debt is paid. Marlowe is gone and your business is on solid footing. But it's not enough to just maintain. We need to grow, to build something that can withstand the next crisis, because there will always be a next crisis out here." Duncan nodded slowly. "What do you have in mind?" Margaret pulled out a notebook from beneath her pillow, making him smile. Of course, she'd been planning even on her wedding night. "I've been thinking about diversification. You're an excellent blacksmith, but that's specialized work. Not everyone needs horseshoes every month. What if we expanded into other metalwork tools, yes, but also decorative pieces, hardware for homes, cookware, things people need regularly? That would require more equipment, more space. More iron stock. It would require investment." Margaret's eyes gleamed with the fervor of a good plan taking shape. "But I've run the numbers. If we dedicate 30% of your time to production items, we could double our income within 2 years. That would let us buy more land, expand the horse breeding operation, maybe even hire an apprentice for the forge, so you're not doing all the work yourself. You've really thought this through." "I think about everything through." Margaret's smile was slightly self-deprecating. "It's who I am. Numbers and plans and 5-year projections." Duncan leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Then it's a good thing I married you. Someone needs to make sure I don't just drift along making horseshoes until I'm too old to lift a hammer." They spent the morning of their first married day doing what they did best, planning. Margaret with her notebooks and projections, Duncan with his practical knowledge of metalwork and ranching. They were well-matched, a partnership of complementary skills that made the sum greater than its parts. By afternoon, Father O'Brien arrived with news. The territorial auditor had begun reviewing Iron Creek Bank's records. The initial findings confirmed Margaret's suspicions. 12 loans showed the same pattern of inflated interest rates. The total fraud exceeded $4,000. Criminal charges against Marlowe were being prepared. More importantly, the auditor had discovered that several foreclosed properties had been sold to associates of Marlowe at below-market prices, suggesting a deeper conspiracy. The territorial government was now involved, and restitution to the defrauded borrowers was being discussed. "You did this," the priest told Margaret. "You saw the pattern, and you had the courage to expose it. There are families who'll keep their homes because of you. I just followed the numbers." Margaret was uncomfortable with praise, had always been. The numbers told the story. "I just listened. Humility is a virtue, but so is accepting credit where it's due." Father O'Brien's eyes twinkled. "You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. Blackwood. This town is lucky to have you." After he left, Duncan pulled Margaret close. "He's right, you know. You are remarkable. I'm stubborn. There's a difference. You're both. And I'm grateful for every stubborn, remarkable bit of you." The winter passed in a blur of work and planning and slow accumulation of small joys. Margaret took over the forge accounts completely, organizing them with a precision that made Duncan shake his head in wonder. She also began offering bookkeeping services to other townspeople, charging modest fees that added up to a respectable side income. Duncan expanded his metalwork as they discussed creating a line of simple but well-made tools that sold steadily. He also took on an apprentice, a young man named Thomas, who'd lost his family to illness and needed both trade and purpose. Margaret drew up the apprenticeship contract, ensuring fair terms for both parties. The main house, empty since Anna's death, slowly came back to life. Margaret didn't change much, respecting the memory of the woman who'd lived there first, but she added her own touches. Her mother's Bible on a shelf, the cameo in a place of honor, her accounting desk by the window where light fell perfect for working. In March, the territorial court ruled on the Marlowe case. Guilty on 14 counts of fraud. The banker was ordered to make restitution and serve 5 years in the territorial prison. The foreclosed properties were reviewed, and in several cases families were given options to reclaim them at the original loan values. Martha Henderson, the widow Father O'Brien had mentioned, was able to move back into her home. She came to the forge to thank Margaret, tears streaming down her weathered face. "You gave me my life back. I thought I'd die in that charity house, but now I can die in my own bed when the time comes." Margaret, moved beyond words, could only embrace the older woman and promise that justice, when finally served, was worth fighting for. Spring came with a rush of green and birdsong and the kind of beauty that made the harsh winter seem like a fever dream. The ranch-awakened horses grew fat on new grass, and Duncan's forge rang with the steady rhythm of creation. Margaret discovered she was pregnant in late April. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but waited to be certain before telling Duncan. When she finally did, sitting at dinner in the house that was becoming truly theirs, his reaction was everything she'd hoped for. Fear first, the shadow of losing Anna, and the baby still haunting him. Then joy so pure and overwhelming that tears tracked down his weathered cheeks. "Are you certain as any first-time mother can be?" Margaret took his hand, placed it on her still flat stomach. "The baby should come in November. First frost, if I've calculated right." "You would calculate it." Duncan's laugh was shaky. "Numbers even for this, especially for this. Everything important can be counted, Duncan. Days, dollars, heartbeats. This is just one more precious thing to keep track of." The pregnancy was not easy. Margaret suffered sickness through the summer months, could barely keep food down until August. Duncan hovered anxiously, was shooed away by Mrs. Patterson and the other church ladies who'd taken Margaret under their collective wing. They knew about babies and husbands, and they knew that sometimes the best thing a man could do was stay out of the way and fetch whatever strange food the mother craved at odd hours. By September, Margaret's stomach had rounded noticeably. She continued working, keeping the accounts from her desk, organizing orders, managing the growing business. Duncan tried to make her rest, but she was having none of it. "I'm pregnant, not injured." She waved away his concerns. "My mother worked until the day I was born. I'll do the same. Your mother didn't have a blacksmith husband who worries constantly." "Then my mother was fortunate." Margaret softened the words with a smile. "I appreciate your concern truly, but I need to feel useful. Let me work until I can't anymore." He did, though it visibly pained him every time she struggled to reach a high shelf or grimaced at a kick from within. November came with the first hard frost right on schedule. Margaret's pain started on a cold Thursday morning, regular and insistent. Mrs. Patterson was summoned along with 2 other women who'd birthed children of their own. Duncan was exiled to the forge, told firmly that babies were women's work and he'd just be in the way. The labor lasted 14 hours. Duncan spent it in agony, pacing the forge, unable to work, unable to think, prayers running through his head in an endless loop. "Please, God, not again. Let them both live. I'll give anything, do anything, just let them live." The cry, when it finally came, was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. A baby's wail, strong and furious and alive. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, her face wreathed in smiles. "You have a son, Mr. Blackwood, a healthy boy with his mother's lungs and your stubborn disposition. And Margaret is well, tired, but well." Duncan nearly collapsed with relief. He stumbled into the house, into the bedroom, where Margaret lay pale but triumphant, a tiny bundle in her arms. "Meet Benjamin." Her voice was hoarse from effort, but her eyes shone. Ben for short, named after my grandfather, the accountant. The baby was impossibly small, red-faced, and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would someday be gray like his father's, but were now the indeterminate blue of all newborns. Duncan touched one tiny fist with a finger, marveled when the baby gripped it with surprising strength. "He's perfect," Duncan's voice broke. "You're both perfect. We're both here." Margaret understood the fear beneath the words. "I'm not going anywhere, Duncan. Neither is Ben. We're your family now, and we Chens are too resilient to die easily." That night, after the women had left, and Margaret slept with Ben in a cradle Duncan had carved during the pregnancy, Duncan sat by the window and wept. Not from grief this time, but from gratitude, from relief, so profound it felt like being reborn himself. He'd been given a second chance, a new family, a future he'd thought was lost forever when they buried Anna. And it had all started with a blizzard and a woman who refused to die and a decision to hope again. The years that followed were kind to the Blackwood family. Ben grew strong and curious, learning to walk by pulling himself up on the anvil, learning to count by watching his mother work. At 3, he could recite his numbers to 20. At 5, he could add and subtract in his head. Margaret's bookkeeping business expanded. She became the unofficial accountant for half of Iron Creek, trusted for her fairness and precision. She also began teaching basic arithmetic to children in the church hall on Sunday afternoons, determined that the next generation would understand numbers well enough to never be cheated the way Marlowe had cheated their parents. Duncan's forge thrived. Thomas proved an apt apprentice, taking over much of the routine work and freeing Duncan to focus on custom pieces that commanded higher prices. They shipped metalwork as far as Cheyenne and Denver, building a reputation for quality that brought steady orders. In 1892, a daughter arrived, Anna Margaret Blackwood, named for the 2 women who'd shaped Duncan's life. She was quieter than Ben, but no less determined, with her mother's dark eyes and serious expression. By 1895, the ranch had expanded to 200 acres. They ran 50 horses, the breeding program Margaret had insisted on proving profitable beyond Duncan's initial expectations. The forge employed 3 men now, and there was talk of incorporating as a proper business. On their 7th anniversary, Duncan and Margaret stood on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and rose. Ben was 9, chasing chickens in the yard. Anna was 3, clutching her mother's skirts and watching her brother with solemn interest. In 1900, when the new century arrived with hope and uncertainty, the Blackwoods celebrated with the whole town. Ben was 12 then, already showing Duncan's aptitude for metalwork, though Margaret insisted he learn proper accounting first. "You'll run a business someday," she told him. Numbers come before hammers. Anna at 8 was her mother's daughter in temperament. Serious observant with a gift for seeing patterns others missed. She'd sit at Margaret's desk for hours copying columns of figures, asking questions about interest rates and profit margins that made the church ladies shake their heads in wonder. The forge employed 7 men by then. Thomas had become Duncan's partner, a master smith in his own right. Together, they'd pioneered new techniques for tool-making innovations that drew orders from across 3 territories. Margaret's bookkeeping practice had evolved into something more. She'd become an informal business consultant, advising ranchers on herd management, helping the general store optimize inventory, teaching young couples how to save for land. She charged nothing for the teaching, considering it her duty to ensure no one else fell prey to men like Marlowe. When the Great War came in 1914, Ben enlisted despite his parents' protests. He was 32, married with 2 children of his own, but he felt the call to serve. Duncan understood having missed his own generation's war. Margaret kept his books while he was gone, writing letters that included profit statements and inventory reports alongside news from home. Ben returned in 1918 whole in body if changed in spirit. He threw himself back into the forge with renewed purpose, expanding into manufacturing for the mining operations that had sprung up in the territory. "Do you ever regret it?" Duncan asked, answering that advertisement, coming west, nearly dying in a blizzard to get here. Her 17 cents, the boarding house, her mother's final breath. Each hardship had been a stepping stone to this Wyoming sunset. She thought about the fear and the cold, and the very real possibility that she could have died in the snow and no one would have known or cared. Then she looked at her husband, weathered and strong gray, threading through his hair now, but his hands still capable of creating beauty from iron. She looked at their children, healthy and loved. She looked at the house and the land and the life they'd built from nothing but determination and numbers and stubborn refusal to quit. Not for a single moment. Her voice was certain. Every hardship led here. To you, to them, to this. And I'd walk through that blizzard again tomorrow if it meant arriving at this same place. Duncan pulled her close, kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Margaret Blackwood. Best decision I ever made was opening that letter you sent. Best decision I ever made was writing it." She leaned into his warmth, watched their children play in the fading light. Well, that and walking, instead of waiting for rescue. The sun set on Iron Creek, Wyoming, on a family built from blizzards and numbers, and the kind of love that starts with desperation and ends with devotion. Margaret Chen had come west with 17 cents and a hope that was almost dead. She'd found a partnership, a purpose, and a home, and the ledgers, always the ledgers, balanced perfectly. 25 years later, in 1920, Duncan Blackwood died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 77. He'd lived to see Ben take over the forge, Anna become a teacher, and 3 grandchildren born. His last words spoken to Margaret as she held his hand beside their bed were simple and true. "Best life I could have hoped for. Thank you for walking through that blizzard." Margaret lived 3 more years, staying active until the end, keeping the books for Ben's expanded metalworks company, teaching arithmetic to yet another generation of Iron Creek children. She died at 71 in her own bed in the house she and Duncan had filled with love and laughter and the steady rhythm of honest work. They buried her next to Duncan on a hill overlooking the ranch under a headstone Ben commissioned from the finest stonecutter in Cheyenne. The inscription was simple: Margaret Chen Blackwood, 1859 to 1923. She walked through blizzards and saved us all. The Starforge Ranch still stands today now in its 5th generation of Blackwood ownership. The original forge is a museum preserved exactly as Duncan left it, the anvil worn smooth by decades of use. Margaret's accounting ledgers are displayed in glass cases, her precise handwriting a testament to the woman who saved a ranch with arithmetic and courage. Every spring the great-great-grandchildren gather at the museum. The youngest ones press their noses against the glass case, staring at great-great-grandmother's ledgers. She could walk through blizzards, their parents tell them. She could make numbers dance. And the children nod, not quite understanding yet, but knowing somehow that the woman in the faded photograph beside the iron rose ring, the one with the serious eyes and the determined chin, had been something rare, something worth remembering. And on cold Wyoming nights when the wind howls like it did in December of 1887, people in Iron Creek still tell the story of the mail-order bride who walked 15 miles through a blizzard, married a blacksmith, destroyed a corrupt banker with mathematics, and built a legacy that outlasted them all. Because some stories, the true ones, the ones about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, those stories don't die. They get passed down generation to generation, proof that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it's facing down armed men. Sometimes it's surviving impossible odds. And sometimes it's simply refusing to give up when everything says you should. Margaret Chen Blackwood refused to give up. And in refusing, she changed everything. The ledgers balanced. The family thrived. The iron remained strong. And onward through generations, the story continues.